Welcome to the International Conference on Sustainability, Transition, and Culture Change, Vision, Action, and Leadership. Today I'm here with Tom Greco, Steve Keen, and Nicole Foss, and my name is Aaron Wissner. We've just finished a futuring technique called the Delphi method. And what we did is we asked the same question to all three panelists, but we didn't allow them to hear each other's response. And then we formulated a second question while they were out of the room. We brought them back into the room, and we asked that second question. And again, we didn't let them hear each other's response. So my first question is, what struck you from this process? What did you find interesting from this process, the process?
People are very interested in what they can do to prepare for what's coming, which is not surprising. But I mean, basically, that means that people are accepting that there are things that are going to change and things that need to be done. And I think that the fact that people are very intensely curious about how to approach the future is a very positive thing.
And also, like, pretty much the same question was asked by each group. Others were more subsequent question, but the basic one about what positive thing can we do, can individuals and local communities do? That was a common theme across the three rooms, even though you didn't collaborate to do it. So that again emphasises your point that it was people's feeling about what they can do at a local level. Well, that was the striking thing, because it happened in three independent rooms at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the people are ready for change, the people in this group at least, and looking for answers as to how to prepare. I also found it interesting, my own response to the questions as well. You know, it varied a little bit from group to group, but it helped me to clarify my thinking to some extent.
In the first round, we actually had, we posed you a question, the same question,
Yep.
which was and I'll find it here. What is going to happen in 2012 and in the near term? You heard that question 3 rooms in a row. How did your response change between the first room and the final room?
I think I said pretty much the same things. I mean, the order probably changed a little bit, but I think I covered pretty much the same ground.
I'd elaborate a bit. So, like, again, much the same thing. But, for example, I talked about the Maastricht Treaty, expecting that to collapse. I gave more detail about what I thought would happen in the other rooms, and talking about the economic situation in America. Again, giving a more elaborated explanation. I didn't come up with anything different, though. The ecological issue, I tended not to consider that properly when I was talking about the near term, because I said, well, I don't expect anything happening immediately. But of course, near term can be in the next 10 to 15 years. And on that front, then I started saying I expected, even though I didn't think we'd see a definitive crisis in the ecological front in that time period, I started saying maybe there'd be a catastrophic event at some time in that time period, which you can't anticipate, but you can say a system as stressed as our planet is could well give rise to a critical event that nobody can deny. Even the most extreme climate change nihilists couldn't deny, for example, a year in which there was no ice in the Arctic, 20 years ahead of when people expect that's going to happen, or definitive proof that Greenland is going to melt completely. Something like that could happen. So I started adding that elaboration into ways which I could be wrong about. Nothing serious, nothing definitively serious in the ecological front in the next 10 to 15 years.
My response has varied a little bit from the first group to the third group, just based on whatever came off the top of my head. Basically, I focused on the metamorphic process, and I think that's a useful mean for us to propagate and to take as an indication of reality. And if it isn't reality, we can make it reality because it results in a happier outcome. I took the short term as being arbitrarily 10 years. And I can see 10 years hence we'll be living a lot differently than we do today. The entire process of going through the chrysalis stage of societal metamorphosis may take longer than 10 years, but I think we're going to see significant change within 10 years.
What did you say during the entire process? What did you say that you didn't expect that you might say?
Nothing really that I can think of.
I've always talked in favour of a debt jubilee, but one thing I suggested, which was said facetiously with the amount of money I chose, but saying rather than a debt jubilee, a modern one could be to give everybody $1 million and say if you're in debt, you must pay the debt down. And whatever you've got left over, you've got to keep. If you don't have any debt, you hang on to the $1 million as a way of a modern jubilee, which would, the old jubilee was cut the head off of the moneylender. Not a bad idea, really. But we can't do it as easily now as we could back in the days of ancient Mesopotamia. So adding that particular idea was something I didn't expect to say. But chopping off heads, fine. The $1 million was variation.
They won't be the responsible ones.
Pardon?
The head chopping won't be on the responsible.
That's one of the great dangers. When you get a terror, you don't necessarily take out the people you should. Yeah.
I don't think I said anything I wasn't expecting to say. I talk about these things a lot. So.
That's part of the thing. We do talk about them a lot, so, yeah.
I'm going to do a question for you, Steve. You maybe partially in jest said the $1 million for everybody. In the U.S., there was something like that where everybody was sent a check for $300 or $600. Everybody, basically.
Well, you copied that from Australia, where they sent everybody a check for $960. So,
how about sending everyone a check for $50,000?
Yeah. I mean, that's quite feasible because what we have is a excessive growth of credit money, debt-based money, and a diminution of the amount of fiat-based money when we have got a mixed fiat and credit system. So what Bernanke did was really give that fiat money to the banks who don't want to lend it, so it stays in their reserves and went nowhere. But if you actually give
Are you saying, Steve, that those credit easing QE2, QE1 didn't do anything?
They gave us a bit of an asset price bubble again, which Bernanke thinks is a good thing, but you poured money into the slowest moving vessel in a financial system.
So where should they have put the money?
Where you said $50,000 per person. I mean, the amount of money they gave out was in the trillions. So to talk about it being something order of $50,000 per person isn't an exaggeration. And if you said, okay, you get the money, but you've got to pay your debt down, that would have caused far faster circulation, a far more effective boost to the economy, and it would have righted the system by getting rebalancing between debt money and fiat money.
Wouldn't that cause like a bubble because all the money would get pushed in, not the debt pay down, but the spending end of it might cause a bubble itself?
You have to also stop asset price bubbles forming again. And that's I've always come down to saying you can't make any monetary reform without cutting off the possibility of another asset price bubble. Because the destructive element of capitalism is asset price bubbles.
How would you stop that, though?
Well, there's the two ideas I put, I think I put in most room, maybe not this one, Jubilee shares and the pill. Did I explain that here?
No.
Okay. A Jubilee share is the idea of redefining shares, which you could do overnight.
Shares, what do you mean shares?
Shares in companies.
Stocks.
Stocks. Okay, redefine stocks so that if you buy a share from a company, it lasts forever, just no change at all. But if you buy it off another speculator, which is what you are when you buy shares, not an investor, a speculator, when you buy it off another investor, it lasts 50 years and then it expires.
So you're talking like an IPO?
IPOs are fine.
You buy it originally, you're buying into the company.
And you last indefinitely. Buy it off another speculator, it'll last 50 years as a time limit. The idea of that would be that you'd no longer be willing to borrow money to buy a share on a secondary market. You wouldn't take out margin loans to buy shares because you only do that because you expect price appreciation, and you only get price appreciation if a share lasts forever. But if a share has a defined history, like it's going to last 50 years from its very first sale to another speculator, there's no way you'd borrow money to buy that share. The terminal value is zero. So the idea of that is to cut off the secondary market, cut off borrowing money to buy shares in the secondary market, which is the real lever for causing asset price bubbles in shares.
Well, then why would anybody buy a share from the original owner?
Well, you might buy it if you wanted a 50-year annuity. But what you're buying is something that will give you dividends for 50 years and then expire.
What if there's no dividends on the share?
Or that you'd also get to the stage where there'd be no point in buying a share unless it yielded dividends under that system. The whole Warren Buffett thing, where you buy a share because you expect its price to rise over time, would not be possible. So you'd actually, that would redefine it to mean that companies would pay dividends out. The whole idea of hanging on to profits and capitalising the prices and getting people making money out of capital appreciation is what gives us, it's one of the sources of asset bubbles. But most companies pay dividends. But they tend to pay about 70%, between 30 and 70% of profits are paid out as dividends. And that's a sustainable way for a capitalist system to work. When they hang on to it and have appreciation and you get caught in asset bubbles, that's what causes capitalism's fundamental endogenous crises. So I'd rather get rid of that possibility by defining shares in such a way that it would only make sense to buy a share if it paid you dividends, and it would only make sense to buy a share off another speculator if you expected a reasonably reliable stream of dividends for 50 years and you wanted an income annuity for that time.
So I'm going to go off just you to
Yep.
pose a question to everybody. Europe is in the news a lot right now. What would you not be surprised to see in the news headlines in 2012 out of Europe for all three of you?
Oh, I would not be surprised to see Greece kicked out of the euro or withdraw out of the euro. Likewise, Italy, Spain, the other PIIGS. But the other alternative might be for greater centralized control politically in the Eurozone. That's more of a stretch, I think.
Same thing, added probably possible military coups. There could be a right one wing in Greece, and there could be a left one wing, one in Portugal, because the Portuguese military actually led this coup against, I think it was Salazar, the previous dictator, because they got radicalised by the whole experience of being colonial occupiers of countries like East Timor. And so there's actually a left-wing history in the politics of the Portuguese army. So there's a possibility for a progressive coup in Portugal. And the army's always been reactionary there, so right-wing coup. But the idea would be about abolishing the debt again. They'd do it because they'd see themselves as being effectively occupied by a foreign financial force, and because the politicians couldn't reach a decision, where there's a history of political coups, military coups, then it could happen. And the two most obvious possibilities are Greece and Portugal, but there's a peripheral chance of Spain and Italy as well. Turkey? Yeah, Turkey, I don't know what the Turkey's actually caught up in the debt bubble particularly. I'm not sure. But certainly Turkey's obviously had a military history, and in that sense a progressive one as well.
I think we're going to see tremendous upheaval in Europe. I think the Eurozone will certainly be smaller by the end of 2012. It might have imploded entirely. It's hard to say whether it will basically shed a few members, attempt to keep going a while longer as a smaller group. But basically, if you shed the periphery, then the center has nothing to feed off anymore, because that's the point of a periphery. And so I think the risk is that the entire project, the entire Eurozone project, could simply implode all at the same time, and then you would see currency reissue in basically all the European countries. It doesn't have to happen within that shorter time frame, but it is possible. It wouldn't surprise me if it did. I think it's certainly quite possible that we would see coups, that we will see anti-democratic movements because a lot of these countries do not have a particularly democratic history. I think we're going to see movements away from democracy. I also think we're going to see an awful lot of asset stripping prior to any kind of actual default and collapse and leaving the Eurozone. And I think the longer they try to keep the thing going, the more asset stripping is going to happen. Basically, I think what Iceland managed to do is to walk away, well, so far have managed to get away with walking away and not being entirely asset stripped, but that's mostly because they don't really have any assets to strip, because they're a rock in the middle of the Atlantic with a really big moat, 300,000 people and a bunch of sheep. And so they're simply far enough removed that they can tell the bankers to take a long walk off a short pier and get away with it. And that doesn't work so well if you're that much closer to the system and you actually do have things that can be pillaged. So they're already suggesting to Greece, we'll sell us a few islands, and a lot of assets in the periphery are currently for sale. The sooner the Eurozone basically falls apart, the sooner I think that asset stripping process might actually be able to stop. So in some ways it might be better if it happens sooner rather than later, because otherwise people end up being penniless in a country owned by foreigners, and that's even worse than being penniless in a country you own yourself. But yeah, I think an awful lot is going to happen in a short space of time in Europe, and the hit that you would take is probably 20% of GDP in a central country, about 50% in a peripheral country, and that's going to be an absolutely massive impact. I don't think there's ever going to be a political mandate for Eurobonds or fiscal union. I mean, really, that would have to be passed by the people who would basically end up paying everybody else's debts. So perhaps people are currently thinking of Germany, Finland, and the Netherlands, but the Netherlands has its own enormous banking problem and housing bubble, so they're actually going to be facing a lot of risk. Germany doesn't have a housing bubble itself, but their banks funded everybody else's. There's massive exposure to the periphery, and their export markets are going to die, so they're going to have problems too. Finland might get away with it, but they're certainly not going to be paying everybody else's debts. So I can't see any kind of sharing of the debt, and when you get countries trying to force the losses into the laps of other people, where national interests diverge, and basically it becomes every man for himself or every country for himself, the collective is over at that point. So I think at some point it is simply going to dissolve, and it may be simply the Eurozone, it may take the whole European Union with it as a political entity, but it's going to be a massive impact for the people of Europe in the short term.
Very specific question. If I was a person living in Greece and I have some euros, I've saved up, in my bank account 10,000 euros. What does it mean for Greece to not be on the euro anymore? I mean, how does that happen? Does my bank account one day just say something else? I don't understand the process.
Well, what tends to, I mean, I haven't been through this, and I haven't studied it carefully, but what I can tell, you normally get told there will be a new currency the next day, and this is the conversion rate from the euro into the new currency. And
then it floats immediately after that?
Immediately. So what it means is you're told you've got to take your euros and get them reissued as a new currency.
What kind of window in time? Because if you actually had euros in your pocket...
Well, you'd be given like about a month to do it, but it would be done overnight. And so if you had any bank balances, you'd be told they are now, rather than being saying 10,000 euros, there might be 5,000 drachma. Doesn't have to go up or down, but that would happen, and you'd get prices would suddenly be written in both currencies, and you'd be told you've got a month in which you can use either currency, and then after that, that's it. You've got to use the new currency.
Why wouldn't people just get Swiss bank accounts and move their euros there?
Well, they would also, you'd have currency shutdown. Like, for example, the conference I went to in Argentina, don't know what's happening down there, but the day before I was paid in pesos by the university for the trip, the government announced that they were no longer going to let you sell pesos. You could buy them, but you can't sell them. So I've now got a stash of about...
What does that mean, like, for dollars? What are you saying?
Well, it means is I have $11,000 pesos sitting in a friend's drawer in Argentina that I can't convert into the $2,500 that it cost me to get there. So
So put that in, if that happened in the U.S., that would mean that,
Well, you couldn't buy foreign goods.
no, so you got paid $2,000 in the U.S. and you couldn't
buy anything with it.
buy euros,
You couldn't, if you wanted to buy anything made in Japan or China, you couldn't do it. Because if it was already in the country, you could, okay? But you couldn't convert it to another currency and take it out of the country. The whole idea is to stop currency flight. So you make a change that means that that money cannot be transferred. So you block electronic transfers. The best example of
This
doing it
seems
recently,
like a huge thing.
Oh, yeah.
it was done by Malaysia. And Malaysia was the only country to come through the Asian crisis fairly unscathed.
With capital controls.
Why'd they do this?
Well, Mahathir basically thought economists were a bunch of wankers, and even worse, because you know what he did to his economic minister, which was just disgusting, but accusing him of sodomy and putting him in jail. But the idea was that the economic minister was pushing for the IMF program to be imposed on Malaysia. Mahathir wouldn't have a bar of it and used the sodomy charge to get rid of his rival, but then put up currency controls and said you can't take money out of the country. If you don't repatriate ringgit within a certain period of time, it expires. And everybody said, he's going against the orthodoxy, he'll fail, blah, blah, blah. And I made the case, actually debating with an Australian economic journalist on an Australian radio program about it. I said, well, Mahathir's gone against the grain, and if he works, it'll be a miracle because everybody wants to bring him down. But in the end, Malaysia did better by stopping the currencies being sent overseas and by forcing any foreign ringgit to be repatriated.
You lock in the investment so it can't be withdrawn.
Yeah.
Is this something that could happen in the U.S.? And what would that mean if it were to happen in the U.S.? Would there be a reason for it to happen in the U.S.?
No, because you're the international reserve currency. And that's partly where the crisis has come from, because America abused that right. Because first of all, when the reason it happened was at the Bretton Woods conference, Keynes wanted to bring in what he calls special drawing rights.
The original
The
Bretton
44
Woods?
one, yeah. He wanted to bring in what he called special drawing rights for international trade. And that would be currencies manufactured by the International Monetary Fund, which were proportional to the size of your GDP in 1944, adjusted for the effect of the war. And you then, to buy anything, you'd need to convert from national currency into SDRs, and then send the SDRs to another country to buy the goods and get them sent back again. So no particular national currency would be used for international trade. And the Americans overruled that because we're the big boys. We just won the Second World War. Pardon me, sending up your country, but this is the truth. And we're the surplus nation, and we don't want to have the controls that Keynes wanted to impose as well on surplus nations. Within 5 years, you're running a deficit. And the surplus nations, which were Japan and Germany, the exact reverse of what Americans expected at the time. And that, in a sense, bled you dry, but it also meant America could buy foreign goods by printing money. And that's the classic temptation of seigniorage, which is partly why you ran this gigantic trade deficits and didn't worry about it, because you could buy with American dollars, effectively all the way through. That's how you financed the Vietnam War. And that actually is what led to the weakening of American economy and culture over time, because just like the British weakened themselves through colonialism, you weakened yourself through international seigniorage. So you don't need to, if you did it, you'd be shooting yourselves in the foot to do stopping the currency being converted into foreign. But I think that will ultimately happen, because it'd be far better for the world if we were using special drawing rights, a non-national currency for international trade, rather than any national currency.
Or multilateral clearing.
Yeah, in fact, that's what it effectively is. Yeah, agreed.
There are only limits on how much you can take out of the country if you emigrate. I think it's $600,000 and above that, you're going to pay a punitive level of tax. That's the first layer of capital controls in the U.S. But I think there's an awful lot more of that to come. I don't see any risk of currency reissue in the United States. If they ever did it, it would be to dispossess foreigners of the money that they have stored in U.S. dollars. But I can't see currency reissue happening in the US because people don't keep money under the bed anyway. They did this in Russia because people didn't trust banks anyway. They were keeping money under the bed, and it was an attempt to control the money supply by dispossessing ordinary people. But I can't see that risk in the US. Certainly in Europe, the risk is immense that if you're sitting on a pile of euros, they might not be legal tender. One way around this that might temporarily help is to sit on a big pile of German euros if you happen to be Greek. Look at the serial numbers. The German ones start with an X. You can differentiate. And Germans, when they get their euros out of the bank machines, they look at them, make sure they're German ones, and if they're not, it's not that uncommon for them to go back in and swap them for ones with an X. So it might buy you a little bit of time if you had German euros instead of Greek ones. But other than that, yes, and you end up having to convert them to something new, and then you have some explaining to do if you've been sitting on a nice big pile of them, because governments tend to regard there being no legitimate reason for sitting on a big pile of cash, and tend to assume that you're a drug dealer or something like that. So it wouldn't surprise me if people turn up with a big pile of something to convert to a new currency if they end up having a substantial fraction of it confiscated. Plus, when you reissue currency, people use it as an excuse to change the value and effectively put all the prices up, which is exactly what they did when they converted to the euro in the first place. And salaries fell and prices rose in a lot of places, so that made life more difficult for people. That would certainly happen again. And what happened in Argentina in 2001 when they dropped the currency peg, it used to be that people used dollars for pretty much everything. Basically, when they dropped the peg, people's debts were still denominated in dollars. Their bank account was now denominated in pesos, and the peso promptly fell 50% against the dollar. So effectively, the burden of debt went up dramatically, and people's purchasing power went down. And then they were told you can only take out $250 a week. It was not enough to live on, and then eventually they weren't allowed to take out anything. So basically, they lost everything that they'd had in the grip of the banking system.
But to ask a personal question here, is the registration desk still open for the hotel? I haven't actually got a room yet. I don't want to be...
Yes, it's
toothbrush in
open
my
24
room.
hours.
Good, thank you. Okay, just making sure. Yeah.
Here's my last question, and then I'm going to ask for cards from the floor. So while they're processing this question, if you could please write down a question and send it up here. Short questions, something that the online audience would benefit from, are probably more effective than very, very specific questions. Okay, it's 2012 now. It's later in the year, actually, and you wake up in the morning and you go to your headline news source and it says, war has been declared in Europe. What's your first thought on how that might have happened?
I don't think it will, but if it did, I think we're a long way from seeing war take place. So really, in trying to envisage how it might happen, I would expect military coups. I'd be quite expecting to see that there's been the Greeks have overthrown the government, arrested the ministers, and so on. The only way that I see a war would be a diversionary one, and you haven't got a political leader of that nature in Germany, in Europe, who can lead a diversionary war.
What do you mean by diversionary?
Oh, invade another country to take the pressure off yourself politically back at home, like the Argentinian generals invading the Falklands was a diversion which sort of backfired on the courtesy of Maggie Thatcher, but that was a diversionary war. Or Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, that was a diversionary war. Not quite diversion, it was after the revenue of the oil, but...
Wars are no longer declared, they just happen, like NATO against Libya. And there's a whole story that remains to be told about that one.
Yeah.
The window dressing that they put up to begin with of saving civilians from this evil dictator is total bullshit. There were other reasons, and I won't state what I think they might be, but that wasn't the reason for going into Libya. The Western powers are in the process of reshaping the entire Middle East, and they're using popular uprisings as a cover to make regime change. For example, in Egypt, nothing much has changed in Egypt. Mubarak is gone, but so what? I mean, the military is still in control, and the people are no more free than they were before. So, there was a lot of exuberance and excitement about the popular uprising, but that can often be taken advantage of by the powers that be to just maintain or enhance the power that they already have.
I don't expect to see wars in Europe between countries, wars within countries perhaps. I can
Yeah.
imagine civil war within a European country, along with military coups and things like that. I think we're a very long way from countries fighting each other. I think it simply takes a long time to get to the point where you have a political mandate for that kind of conflict. It may come eventually, but I certainly don't see it happening at the same speed as the impacts in finance and the real economy. Basically, finance happens quickly, the real economy has a time lag of perhaps months. Political changes have a time lag of perhaps years, and going from the point where you elect some kind of political extremist to the point where there's a popular mandate for then actually engaging in conflict takes longer still. So there's a reason why we had a crash in 1929 and it was 10 years before we had a war.
Yeah.
It simply takes time to work all that through the process. And so I'm not expecting any kind of war in Europe soon, other than internal conflicts within specific countries.
Yeah.
Are you implying that the structure of the economic system itself had something to do with the Depression, and that in turn caused the war to happen, the Second World War?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. And there's one of the best books Keynes wrote was called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, because he was in the Versailles Treaty, the advisor to England, and he saw how the French were trying to use reparations to destroy Germany permanently. And he basically said that would have worked if it was a feudal system. We'd just take all the resources away. But it doesn't work in a financial system, and it'll lead, I think he actually did predict hyperinflation. He certainly predicted they'd lead to rearmament by Germany in the Second World War. So you could see that if you had that sort of capacity to look at the systemic processes, which Keynes certainly had, then you could see the Second World War coming from 1919. But a major reason why
Did he actually talk about a war coming?
Yeah, he did. And the thing
Another war?
Yeah.
After the Great War?
Yeah, in 1919. And part of the reason it happened was that, again...
Because of the Depression?
Yeah, well, the Depression helped the rise of Hitler. Keynes expected Germany to rearm in response to what France tried to do, and that would lead to armed conflict. So, and he was quite right. He certainly said rearmament of Germany. It was done to prevent the rearmament. He said it won't happen. The Germans will effectively debase the payments and aim to rearm after the attempt by France to cripple them, because that was really what the French tried to do at the Treaty of Versailles.
The reparations were unpayable.
Totally. They were meant to be unpayable.
And
it was
besides
a national
that,
humiliation.
France went in and stripped Germany of its most productive lands.
The Ruhr.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Keynes saw all that happening, and this just has to lead to a rearmament by Germany and another war to get even, to get back the territory that's been falsely taken off them by France, because really, in one sense, nobody was responsible for the First World War. It was the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It wasn't anything that America should have been involved in, or Australia for that matter. It was in that sense the last gasp of a feudal empire breaking down, leading to a huge, overblown continent-wide conflict, which was unnecessary. The Second World War was a necessary response to that process. But the rise of Hitler came about because Hitler, when he came to power, Germany had a massive level of unemployment, and it was largely due to the American banks refusing to roll over the debt German industry owed it, and causing a huge financial crisis in Germany. And then when Hitler came to power, he was told to balance the budget, and he basically told his economic minister where to go, laughed him out of the room, ran huge deficits, built a welfare payment system, and built the industry for rearming. And basically Germany went from 25% unemployment to full employment, and that's why people in Germany regarded Hitler as a god. So he got his legitimacy out of taking a contrarian approach to conventional economics to get out of the Depression and succeeding. And that played a huge role in his rise, and then of course led to the Second World War as well.